Thanks everyone for beaming in today. Welcome to the next talk in our monthly series as part of the launch of our new Center for Archival Futures Cafe at the University of Maryland's iSchool. I'm Diana Marsh. I'm a first year as an assistant professor of archives and digital curation here. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of this region, the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors on whose territory I live and on which the University of Maryland resides. As a land-grant university, I want to further acknowledge the 202,000 acres of indigenous land distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. And I'll link the Land Grab U project after I do my intro here. I also acknowledge the separation that these and other acts of colonialism and assimilation generated between indigenous peoples and their homelands, as well as the knowledge held in archives, museums, and libraries. I also want to note that I'm wearing red today to honor May 5th as a new National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This was announced yesterday by the Biden administration, and I want to ask you all to take a look at the new proclamation and to help increase awareness of this issue. I want to further acknowledge the continued power and resilience of Indigenous communities and nations. Those of us working with Native and Indigenous archives are very grateful for the patience and goodwill of communities as we try to work together to shift practices in the field. As I've heard Kirsten Thorpe say in other talks, we have a lot of work to do. And we're very grateful to have Kirsten here today to talk about this work in other international contexts. Kirsten Thorpe is a senior researcher at the Jumbana Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney. Kirsten has broad interests in research and engagement with Indigenous protocols and decolonizing practices in the library and archive field. After some 20 plus years of work in the area, she's been involved in numerous projects involving the return of historic collections to Indigenous peoples and communities, and advocates for transformation of practice to center Indigenous priorities and voice in areas of data, records, and collections management. She's also been instrumental in the development of protocols, policies, and services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in libraries and archives in Australia, and really just advocating for change on a broad scale. In 2018, Kirsten began her PhD at Monash University to investigate Indigenous cultural safety and self-determination in Australian libraries and archives. We're all really looking forward to her talk today on working with Indigenous Australian peoples to support community archiving and cultural safety. And I'll just say, Kirsten, we are so grateful to you for offering to come speak with us at 6 a.m. your time. And I'm very sorry I can't beam you any coffee. To guests here today, I and coordinator Beth Domingo will be monitoring the chat. Feel free to post comments and chat as you go, but we'll wait until the Q&A to address those questions. And now, Kirsten, I'll hand the Zoom floor over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Diana. I'm just going to share my screen. So thanks for having me. Yesterday, I got up early thinking that I was talking Australian Wednesday time. So I'm feeling much more fresh today, which is really fantastic. And I can see that my colleague, Monica Galassi, is here. So thanks, Monica, for getting up 2 days in a row to be here. So Diana, thank you for the introductions and also for the acknowledgements. I really like doing these things. I have to admit, I'm not a morning person. So I hope I warm up in terms of the talk, but I'm always keen to connect with people, and particularly in this space of learning. And I guess what I'm hoping to do today is share a bit of a story of what I've been doing. I had my PhD final seminar on, what day was it? I'm getting confused with the days. Tuesday. And, I'm sort of getting to the end, so I'm feeling that exhaustion of the PhD process. But one of the sort of methods and tools that I've been using in my PhD is story work from Joanne Archibald. So when I was thinking about what to present today, I thought, what better place than to start telling a story of what I've done and to bring some messages through that. So obviously, just to make sure my screen, it's really important in an Australian context as well to acknowledge country. I sort of relocated out of the city in COVID, so I'm an hour and a half north of Sydney. So I want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Guringai people, um, and acknowledge the wider Darkinjung community. It's actually contested land, so I offer an acknowledgement of both Guringai and Darkinjung, in acknowledgement that that's other people's business to work out and work through those histories. I also want to acknowledge other Indigenous people who might be here today, but also acknowledge the care that people have taken in looking after this land. And thank you, Diana, for the context of talking about the situation in the US as well. It was good to hear that that's happening. So a little bit of what I'm talking today is about cultural safety. So I also want to mention that, you know, I'm not going to delve deeply into talking about issues of trauma, but I will be talking about, in an Australian context, members of the stolen generation. So just to let people know that if there's any triggers. But yeah, hopefully, I always sort of think in my work, it's been around those really hard and difficult kind of stories, but also looking at the light that can come out of that. And I was sharing before, the sun's just coming up, but I wanted to, I don't know if I should, can you hear the kookaburras right now at all?
Yeah, we can.
That's like isn't that beautifully timed that I just said, hello kookaburras. So this is where I'm placed, a beautiful place up the coast. So I feel really fortunate to be here. So I guess starting out and thinking about Australia, and you know, there might be some other people here from Australia who are very familiar with this map of Indigenous Australia. So this is a map that was produced by an anthropologist, Horton, and it's, you know, still contested, but this is sort of one of the tools that we use to demonstrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. My family is sort of zoomed in on the right there. On my mum's side are Worimi people from Port Stephens, so you know, probably 3 hours from Sydney. And I guess, you know, particularly as I've done the PhD in the last couple of years, I've sort of thought about the space that I've occupied, and you know, I've wondered why I've persisted in working in archives. And I think a lot of the work that both myself and my two sisters do is in recognition of my grandmother. So I want to acknowledge her today as well. If you have a chance to go into the map, I've got lots of links in the talk today. So I'm happy to share that, Diana, afterwards if people want to have a look. But it's pretty awesome to go in and to, you know, this is how I envisage Australia. And I guess in the work that I've done in libraries and archives, this is sort of, you know, the interface for me to be thinking about both people's user experience, but their connection to our history in this way. And I guess in this context, I sort of, you know, in the space of thinking about archives, our, you know, record keeping legacy in Australia is, you know, the really obvious record keeping legacy is in our paper-based, our, you know, archive and manuscript collections that date from 1788 and the arrival of Europeans. But I always try and imagine in the work that I do of thinking about this context, this is a mural that used to exist in inner city Sydney, and I just love, you know, even though we've sort of, you know, there's more work happening in Australia to look at our long histories, but I love this. 40,000 years is a long time. 40,000 years is still on my mind. And when I do these talks, I think about that idea that, you know, our history is, it's about 2,000 generations of people being here and caring for this land. And, you know, how I'm really interested in how we build a view of that history and the archives of, you know, this beautiful country in a way that honors those 2,000 years. So as I mentioned, let's get back to that one. I thought I would sort of tell a story and leave some good time for questions. But I thought I would sort of talk about how I ended up in the field, and guess what's led me to do my doctoral research and the work now at Jumbana. I always feel like I didn't wake up and want to be an archivist. I didn't. Sometimes I wish that I just had a boring job in a fish and chip shop, sort of serving people. But I've ended up in a place that I've had so many experiences that have sort of compelled me to really use. I always describe it as being my mind, body, and spirit that have really sort of pushed this work, because it's been pretty intense. So Diana sort of introduced that I started in the sector a couple of decades ago, and I've been, as part of my PhD, going back and doing a lot of autoethnographic writing, and I found the ad of where I applied for my cadetship at the archives, and I sort of see this now as the moment that the official work started for me. And so in the late 1990s, the New South Wales government, so New South Wales, Sydney being the capital, I guess there was awareness after the Bring Them Home report that investigated the removals of Aboriginal children from their families. There's real recognition that libraries and archives had a significant role to play. And it kind of came on the back of another report into Aboriginal deaths in custody that was done in the late 1990s that made some pretty compelling recommendations in Australia for action, for people to look at the records held by government and other institutions for identity. And really significantly in Australia at the moment, we're all seeing an increase in the numbers of deaths in custody, and we're seeing that the recommendations haven't been implemented. So I guess, I look back at this 20 years ago and think my role was to go in and work with the records of the New South Wales Protection and Welfare Board. So that was a government agency that basically, had absolute control over people's families officially from 1883 to 1969. So, I'll talk a little bit about it, but, this was the act that started the Stolen Generations, but also did they created the reserve systems and did things like administered people's monies. So I've put some links at the bottom there to different things to look at. And I've also decided in this talk that I've put some citations of things that I wrote at the time that when I go back and read them, I think, it's really interesting, because I think I was trying to find a voice in practice to be able to say, this is what's happening where I'm working. So I read them now with much interest, of being in my early 20s doing the work. But yeah, I've just put them in the bottom. And I wanted to mention with the Healing Foundation, I had a look yesterday because I was sort of thinking about the numbers, and they say at the moment that there's still 17,150 Stolen Generation survivors. That was the last kind of count in 2018. So, it's ongoing and unfinished business in an Australian context. I think here, we've been quite good in, the sorry statements, the recognition, but where we fall down in Australia is really looking at the action that's aligned to that. So when I ended up at the archives, I was in this really interesting position that I think, everyone said, we've finally got an Aboriginal person that works here. In my view, a lot of people thought that meant if someone came into the reading room and they were really upset or they needed a hand, that I was the interface. I would go straight out and talk to people, which of course is what I wanted to do. People traveled for a long way to get there. But, in the first couple of months, I just thought, first of all, how have I ended up here? What has compelled me to do this? I shared a house with my sister at the time, and used to say to her, I felt like I was entering a parallel universe when I went in, because I was also on a reference desk doing convict histories, immigration, this whole spiel, but then sort of doing the Aboriginal liaison role when people would come in. So I sort of, I guess I've got siblings and a family who have been, politically engaged in different contexts, or, uncles that are poets. And I guess I had that energy in me to think about a different frame. But very early on, I knew that I couldn't operate in the way that you know, the archives had expected of me, and I really had to think about doing something different. So the article on screen is really interesting because I probably in early 2000 I thought, you know, this is never going to work for communities coming in and, you know, accessing these records that are so destructive. So I thought, well, how do I get the evidence of the needs of the archives? I was in, you can see from that ad, a very low position. I even had to wear a badge that said cadet. So I felt like I was sort of, you know, being led by other really amazing archivists at the time, but this was a really new space to be working with these records. So I sort of built my knowledge of the collection, and I ended up using opportunities to go out and launch these things called archive resource kits. So I would go out to communities as much as I could without any resources, and I would do these interviews with local newspapers so that I could launch the kit, and then I would spend the rest of the time going and meeting with community members, and basically at that time doing focus group sessions to say to people, you know, what do archives mean to you, and how can we help you? So I find that, you know, I look back and I'm actually really proud of myself that I, you know, constructed these moments to do this work, but I'm also really, you know, 20 years later, I'm really sort of, I'm not angry, I wouldn't say it at that level, but I'm so frustrated to see that, you know, this took my own agency to do this work. And it was actually really quite hidden. The pictures on the side, person at the top is my auntie, and she's near a grinding stone near Wollombi. And these are other really important sites in New South Wales. So I feel like I was kind of leading this double space of engagement to push things. And always when I was at work, my identity was there for everyone to be engaged with, which I was very proud of, you know, my history. And as I mentioned, you know, my grandmother and my grandmother's family. But I always felt like there was something of me that was on trade in this work. So the archives couldn't actually fully participate themselves in this. So, I mean, this is a lovely article of my son, Sam, who turned 19 the other day, but always kind of, you know, sharing stories. And I guess, you know, the flip side is that I wanted to build trust with communities at the same time. But this picture on the right, when I look at this, I think it was a folder that was done at the time in 2002. And I managed to sort of get the resources to package up all the archive leaflets and take this beautiful folder to community with a message it's sort of almost invisible there, but it says, take the knowledge back home. And that's been my driver to get out of the archives, to go to communities and to hear people's stories, and then to, I guess, facilitate a process where people can engage with content, but not in a way that the content in, or the records that are held in archives or, you know, libraries are privileged, but actually trying to mold those two things together. And the article down the bottom is something I sort of wrote way back in 2001, looking at the efforts of Australia and how much had been done. And probably, you know, we've edged a little bit further, but still, as I always say, as Dinah was saying, there's a lot more to do. So I think at that time I wanted to mention the ATSLM protocols. There was something that gave me a sense of hope in this sole position, sitting in the archives, you know, around these Protection and Welfare Board records, thinking, you know, they were unindexed, they were inaccessible, people coming in really, really, you know, stressed out. They wanted their information. I was the interface, the person with the tissues, all of those scenarios that we probably all know or are familiar with. And the protocols were the only thing that were sense-making tools for me at that time. I had people in the community, and, you know, my elder sister was someone that I used to get advice from, but the protocols that were launched in Australia, and I know that they've had an impact, and acknowledging also the work in the US context with the Native American protocols, they really were the tool for dialogue, because they were something I almost felt like I carried around and said to people, hey, you know, we can't work in this way that you're suggesting because of this context. So I guess I mentioned that because I felt certainly a failure when I did my cadetship. I did postgraduate studies here in Australia, and there was nothing that I did that equipped me for my job. There was absolutely nothing. And I remember just thinking at the time, this is so white, you know, this is a history of white record keeping. You know, I worked in the archives, and I really, you know, State Records had a big push at that time for government record keeping. You know, I was all across, you know, the importance of, you know, record keeping for evidence, curation of stories. I really felt that, but at the same time, I was engaging with this course content that continued that privilege through the course structures. So I went away and wrote protocols for the archives. And again, I like going back to look at them because they were really simple things like, you know, if elders come in, please make sure that we feed people and we have a space for people to sit down and be comfortable. And so I guess some, you know, pretty basic gestural things that institutions perhaps don't always think about. And at this time, I can hear it's pouring rain outside. Is that something that's coming through for you all?
I can't hear
it.
It's
okay. Okay. It's beautiful. So yeah, 2005, I don't know if people know the work of Professor Martin Nakada. Martin is a Torres Strait Islander man that started to write, he wrote a book called Savage, someone, Monica might have to pull me up, Disciplining the Savages, Savaging the Disciplines. And Martin sort of at that time came up with you know, theoretical concepts around both Indigenous standpoint and the cultural interface. And I feel really fortunate again in this kind of mix of the work that I did that Professor Martin Nakada and Professor Marcia Langton, who's also really significant in an Indigenous context in Australia for her research and contribution, they started to build these seminars. It was probably a response to the ATSLAM protocols, but they started to bring this spotlight into the archive sector, and they brought, I'm really appreciative to them now because they were bringing both scholars at the time who were coming and engaging with archives and building databases, but they also brought us all in as practitioners to give voice to the experiences that we were having. And this again is another really interesting resource. And when I look back, and I've written in my doctoral studies about, you know, being in this situation where I was doing all this really, really challenging work in the archives, you know, facing all this multitude of problems around, you know, no indexing, a lack of appropriate services, and the backdrop of a whole other colonial collection beyond just this one set of records, trying to get out to communities and navigate this in a position that was highly underpaid at the time. And then I found these opportunities to go and write and speak. And again, when I talk about, you know, going out, I'm so disappointed that there weren't people there. All the support, I guess, at the time was very informal, and the workplace wasn't a place that was actually recognizing the labor that I was putting into this. But the sentiments that I share in those articles, it isn't far from what I would think now. I just had to always write as well as a government employee and thinking about that frame, which is something else, I guess, to talk about. So a couple of projects that I wanted to share. These are not highly visible in terms of work that was done. There's probably a few legacy items that exist in published materials, but I was involved in the In Living Memory exhibition. It was launched in 2006, but we really took the opportunity with this project to go out and meet with people and So we did this incredible engagement that if I model the approach now for this, and then I look back to what we were doing, we were actually leading a process of fully participatory and engaged Indigenous research ethics processes. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that everything was perfect, but we took the time saying that we want to build an exhibition. We went out and we returned the photos. That's a picture of me down the bottom with Aunty Nolly Briggs, who has a centre in Moree in northern New South Wales. And at the top, Mervyn Bishop, who is a renowned Indigenous photographer in Australia. So we went out as a team and we talked about these images, and we saw the significance of curating this exhibition at not being about us, but actually being about the stories that people wanted to tell. And we made sure that anything that went into that exhibition had full informed consent. And that meant to us that we didn't show an image, although they were open to public access, they could be used. Often people would turn on the news and there would be a story about the stolen generation, or our Sorry Day, which is in May, and people would see the images. So they were circulating everywhere, but we sort of said in terms of creating an exhibition that it had to be about us listening and not being in a position of us dominating and controlling the narrative. And we had to really reflect and see it as an opportunity for healing. I'm just going to turn my light out because I think the sun's risen now. That's better. So yeah, a really important process for us. And why I mentioned In Living Memory is, it was transient. It happened in the city. We had an exhibition that kept going for a little while. It was a great team that put it together, and I was the only part of that team. But we also had community saying to us, well, you can't just do this in the city, you have to take it out. So it went on this tour all around the state to visit people. And yeah, I'm really, I reflect on that approach and think that if we inbuilt some of these processes, that we would have a much more interesting sort of landscape. It was pre-digital. So there's a lot of printing. We had databases, but digitization wasn't necessarily a big thing at the time. And I don't actually know if you revisited this now, I wouldn't say that we couldn't do it in a digital landscape, but I wonder what some of the elements would be that you would want, weave into that process to make it, to sort of inbuild those relationships. One of the other things that came along at the time that I was at the archive, so I spent a decade there and was pretty happy to get out when it finished. But another really significant project that came up was the Aboriginal Trust Fund Repayment Scheme. And sort of when I talk about what my work now and what my doctoral studies are also about, I think that, the scheme was quite an amazing opportunity for, there's the kookaburras again. The scheme was an amazing opportunity for us to use records for reparations, but it was so incredibly flawed because basically people were coming in to use the records of the former Protection and Welfare Board. So the government held monies in trust. It's a whole other story. So supposed trust. So in my case, my mum's grandmother, Violet Newland, is on that list. The government decided the women that they would, Aboriginal women, that they would keep monies for. And so you had it sort of a docket system that you would go in and exchange for food. And a lot of that money wasn't given back to people. But in cases of Stolen Generation members, they actually, money's much more significant. Money was held. And so some people were getting repaid $30,000, for example, for not having their wages given to them at the time. But the scheme taught me a lot because it was a substantial moment in our history. However, I think our field in Australia, we didn't have the research and scholarship at the time to really be at the forefront of changing this. So we had lots of lawyers in, we had lots of people who were, sort of looking at human rights frames, but the records themselves were still perpetuating harm because they were so incomplete. All they did was provide the narrative of government, which was insufficient. And the scheme did some things like people could, provide a statutory declaration to say, I didn't receive the money. However, I think it was still really flawed, and we could have done a lot more. And right at that time was when the Trust and Technology project was happening at Monash University. And that was sort of my moment where I, for so long sort of thought, what am I doing? I'm trying to, find power and agency, and through my own sort of capacity build, connections and support people. But structurally and on a systemic level, things were really pretty seriously problematic. So at the time, there were two sort of agendas that came probably around 2006, the Trust and Technology project at Monash University. So my current supervisor, Professor Sue McCamish, and Lynette Russell at Monash were involved with that. And Dr. Shannon Forkhead as well did her PhD at the time. So really started to give evidence to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with telling stories. And there's a couple of documents that still exist with that project, a statement of principles relating to Australian Indigenous knowledges, and another exposure draft on human rights, Indigenous communities in Australia, and the archives they still stand up from that period. And I put this up here because I was thinking about connecting with you all and talking to Diana and thinking about Ricky, who I know is a colleague of yours or past colleague. At that time, I had an opportunity through Monash University to connect with people like Anne Gilliland at UCLA. And, I think in terms of the work that we all do, if you're in challenging situations, that was like this beacon of hope. That it was probably the first time out of an Australian context that I got the international sort of paradigm that we were working in. And I heard people talk about, a diversity of needs in terms of people's memory keeping requirements. I think I got that sense more so of people being subjugated by record keeping systems, and where I hadn't necessarily before thought that it was only in Australia and only in my context, but I sort of got that that wider sense. So I feel really fortunate to have been a part of them. And I also went and did my master's at Monash and did a little bit of research at that time, looking at one community in New South Wales and their record keeping needs around a community archive. So I think at that time it really started to give me an opportunity to think about, we've got this space in sort of an institutional record keeping context that is being privileged, but what I want to do is keep that sentiment of how I take that knowledge back to communities, and not in the way that knowledge was everything, but people had material in the archive that they wanted as resources locally. So how could we meld that through in a way that people had the right of reply, they could add their context to records, but not always thinking that the state would control that. And that sort of led me, again, going back to the work of Professor Martin Nakada, and Dr. Alice Byrne, I should mention as well, had been involved in the creation of the protocols really early on. And I sort of had a moment when I was at the archives with all of that work, and I started to get involved on a reference group with this project, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Data Archive at UTS, which is still there, and really acknowledge their work. Sort of, I'm not someone who would think I had epiphanies very often, but I remember thinking, I just have to get out of this archive. This is destroying me. I really felt the weight. My health started to suffer from being there. And I think it was on a really sort of emotional and spiritual level. I just felt sort of done by being around those destructive records. And I went over to this project at UTS, and I worked with Martin and Alex and colleague Gabrielle on some of the protocols that were that established at CEDA. So this was really interesting to me because it was about research data. And so what we were doing, and I would, it was such a different experience for me, because I was, you know, fully supported. I would go out and talk to researchers about their research data. I guess I took the lessons from, you know, records being kept where people are, you know, the subject of the record and they're othered all the time, and started to talk to researchers about, you know, what would it look like if you embedded an appropriate ethical process into your research data management. And you know, so many of the conversations that I had, people would look at me so blankly, and I always thought, we're onto something here, because people are so confused with what we're saying. And it's you know, Martin and Alex, they really were sort of, this was 2009, I think, that we started this project. We as in they did. But it was really starting to think about the open access movement in libraries and academic libraries, and thinking about what is an Indigenous engagement at this time. So yeah, again, if you want to have a look at that website, things are still progressing there. So I had a bit of a, see what happened to my slides. I sort of had a bit of a segue after that, and I'm going to run through these sort of a little bit more quickly so we can get to some questions. And Dr. Alex Byrne left at CEDA and he went to the State Library of New South Wales. And Monica, a colleague I can see on the screen there, has sort of been with me on a bit of this journey. So Alex went over to the State Library of New South Wales to be the state librarian, and you know, we had lots of discussions about, you know, the potentials of going to a major cultural institution like the State Library and doing some work. And so for, yeah, almost 5 years, I went with Alex, and while he was state librarian, I experimented with my colleagues and did the work to see how we could actually shapeshift some things in a major colonial collecting institution. And colleagues, Nathan Sentence, people might know Nathan, he has a great voice online now with his Archival Decolonist blog, and Ronald and Melissa, who have been at the library for a long time. I guess we started to look at these amazing collections and think of what we could do. So I got involved in some language projects, you know, significant funding going into making historical language collections accessible, and curating content online, and trying as much as possible to bring some of those sentiments that I talked about with In Living Memory that framed engagement to the library context. We experimented a little bit. This is an Aboriginal language list from Sydney. People know the famous Bondi Beach is an Aboriginal word. So this is recordings from surveyors at the time. So no informants, which is really unfortunate. Which Bondi, they had recorded as noise made by sea wave breaking on the beach. And Coogee, for anyone who's visited Australia, Coogee is like a really flash suburb in Sydney, really expensive real estate. And I always laugh at this one because it says bad smell caused by the decay of large quantities of seaweed washed ashore. So it's definitely changed a bit since then. So I did some experimentation with the DX lab at the State Library, and led by Paula Bray, and working with the team and other colleagues. Paula did some really great stuff where, you know, she would do a sort of development sprint, and we would get a technologist in to work with the data. And as much as possible, we would try and sort of look at the ways that we could bring those ethical practices back. And this one, More of You, I remember I went on our national radio, Wendy Harmon, I forget, it's ABC, and when I got on, it was like a live interview, and she said to me, "Kirsten, so, you know, are you telling me that now when we drive through every town, we're going to have an app that tells us the language that we're on?" And I was like, "No, we won't do that. But what we're doing is showing the historical data, you know, on Google Maps in that place." So it's always that thing of, you know, the ability of the technology to take us forward, but then honoring people reconnecting with this material and seeing whether it is actually correct. did the surveyors write the information down, or are we just duplicating? We're taking this material that is flawed into a digital realm and privileging it in another space. So exciting stuff, but I would always try and do things like this. And I know Monica, her colleague Brad in Northern New South Wales, we would try and get people's voice in all the time. So Brad says, yeah, the first thing I can see is that the collection doesn't record the names of Aboriginal people that were the informants. So it's like, let's not get too carried away with the technology, because there's something still wrong here. So yeah, pretty powerful. And very quickly, did a couple of projects there that if you're interested to look online, that I'm really proud that the team pulled together. And for me, really significantly, in 2015, we built a new Indigenous collecting strategy that actually got the library on board, and people were really supportive of this. So when there were new acquisitions to the library, we got the acquisition team to start to do an assessment of, and it basically account saying how many collections are we acquiring either through purchase or donation that were created by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people versus things that are created about. And again, surfacing that the evidence of this was really interesting, because people started to go, oh, everything that we're acquiring is about Aboriginal people, so what are we going to do about it? So that document's there too. Now I'm really going to run through where I'm at now. I guess I had enough. That's the end of that era. I've kind of turned to research now in a way, and I wrote this article at the time. I think, I was so sick of hearing myself trying to be polite all the time and taking that government, taking my role as a public servant kind of serious, but also bottling up all of this, this energy to try and do the changes. And I sort of thought, if I've done 20 years of this now in practice, what can I do with research? And, I've shared some of the articles, but they were sort of, they were reflective. They weren't, it's nice if people read them, but I still feel that I was constrained. So in 2019, I came over to Jumbunna and been doing some work there. Jumbunna is an Indigenous research institute at UTS. And I feel so fortunate. Jumbunna is led by distinguished Professor Larissa Barrent, who in an Australian context, Larissa is a legal scholar. As an Aboriginal woman, she's a legal scholar, she's a filmmaker, and she's a writer. And I guess she really, these are all the hubs that we have in Jumbunna research, but Larissa really understands the context of us needing that counter storytelling in our history. And she understands the power of structures like the law. So I think, feel really fortunate to be working there at the moment and pushing. Here's some of the things I'm not going to go through in detail, but really looking at open source community controlled IT, looking at Indigenous protocols and the recognition of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights. And I guess trying to think of a way that we can start to push this this moment beyond us, having just exhibitions and just moments to do the right of reply, but try and embed it in the way that institutions might work. And I know we've still got a way to go with that. So we're collaborating with Washington State University with the Mukurtu project. We're really interested in the community of practice around that. So we've sort of taking the hubs and spokes model from you all and across the US and looking at what we can do here, totally unfunded. But we've got some good projects bubbling away where, we're sending kits out to communities to digitize. And again, thinking about that, collections on country, living archives on country, but training people along the way and not thinking about being extractive. So I'm going to quickly mention my PhD and then turn over to some questions and have a breath. So my doctoral studies are just, I've got the next sort of 3 months to write up and submit. So I feel really fortunate. I've been able to sort of consolidate, and using autoethnography and story work, thinking about, those changes that I've been able to facilitate, or, the things that I just saw as, so systemically wrong in the sector across, I guess, that space of, government archives, library systems, looking at research data. And I've had some amazing participants to my research and really want to acknowledge them. I've sort of delved deep into the topic of Indigenous cultural safety. So looking at this question of, how do the systems that we're engaging with, how do they continue to perpetuate harm? And thinking really broadly about this, both physical, digital spaces, systems, policies. The feedback from the panel is there's way too much, but I keep saying, I'm not suggesting that I'm going to answer these, but there's some pretty compelling stuff that we need to talk about. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that. And I think, there's a couple of sort of major findings that are coming out from it. One that I'll share is I've been thinking about the work of Indigenous people in the sector and sort of positioning people as being warriors in the archive. You're recognizing that all the change is happening because it's facilitated through people and their work, and institutions are responding to that. And the other is sort of our failure in all of those digital experiences and in the care that we take of people encountering to, in our gaps in the protocols, to not really deeply talk about spiritual and emotional needs in terms of archiving. So I'll be very deep in that for the next 3 months, but looking forward to it. And I just wanted to end with the collective. So if people want to get involved with that, we're actually about to start a bit of a campaign in Australia around offensive books, and we're waiting to hear the response of people talking about censorship, but we want to do a call out for materials that exist in our libraries that are just so offensively wrong, and start to get them off the shelves. So you might be interested in that. But thank you so much. I think we've still got good time for questions, Diana. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yes, thank you so much. Feel free to throw questions in the chat, and you're also welcome to, of course, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. If we need to do hand raising, we can do that as well, depending on demand.
So can I try a question?
Sure thing, Doug.
Okay, so I'm Doug Ward. I had the opportunity to spend 5 months in Australia on sabbatical, and somewhat randomly wandered into IATSIS, which you haven't mentioned at all on this path. And it got me thinking, as you were talking, how very complex the institutional space is here, right? I mean, archives exist in our society for a set of purposes, libraries for a different set of purposes, some overlap, museums for yet a different set of purposes, again, some overlap. And here the purpose isn't really, in universities, yet another, right, study institutes, the purpose really isn't aligned well with any of these. Is there a need for the emergence of a fifth way? Is there something that should be built specifically to do this, and can draw from the others where it's useful, but maybe some of this angst is about working in an institution that wasn't designed for this in the first place?
Absolutely, Doug, and thank you. IATSIS are so significant in the Australian context, and we all look to IATSIS for that, standard setting. I think, with the lot of work happening at the moment with language codes being incorporated into things like Trove at the National Library, so really starting to change things. But my observation is that we're all still suffering from this colonial collecting paradigm. We're not looking at communities' needs to say, as you say, there's actually this significant gap that we're not supporting in terms of local memory keeping needs. For me, it's about the protection of the environment as well. Mining companies coming in, what's the evidence to say that sites are significant? Well, that's in people, but if they start to look at, mechanisms like going into the law or having cultural heritage studies, there needs to be another approach. So, I'm really hopeful. I think IATSIS is having a really significant transformation at the moment, and I know in their collecting areas that they're doing that transformative work as well. So hopefully they'll be the leaders in this space, and I hope as well that the work that we're doing at Jumbunna can kind of bolster that evidence that's needed to make the turn. Thank you. Yeah.
We have a question from Victoria. Do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, I think it was right towards the end. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed that. And I'm curious if you can say more about some of the community engagement with community ownership of technology. I'm just thinking about all of the sort of enterprise barriers there and how you're working around them.
Yeah, thank you. So we have lots of interesting conversations. I've been talking to Kimberly Kristen for many years about Mukurtu and the software, and I think there's still a lot of work to go in terms of it having the aspiration for communities to engage with it in a way that's really easy, because looking at people's digital literacy skills and bringing them on that journey is, I think it has to be resourced, and we don't have that in Australia. So for us at the moment and the work that we're doing in Jumbunna, I guess we're using the Mukurtu project to start to talk about things like digital stewardship. We're talking to people about, what are their needs? But for us, I think we're going back to that model again of going out and saying, okay, so we want to work with you, but what do you need from us? And in the case of Brewarrina that I was mentioning, they have an amazing cultural centre, no technology in the centre. I think there might be one computer on the front desk. Things are actually in a state that people have laminated prints on the wall of historic photos, black and white. But there's all these incredible photos that people have at home. So what we have done is we've bought this kit. The State Library of New South Wales has helped, and we're sending scanners out and a couple of laptops and hard drives, and basically starting from scratch with people and trying to zoom in and do that. So everything is very slow, but I think what's exciting for us is that people are talking about, people could train in this work, people could get jobs out of it. So we're trying not to let the technology overtake us in terms of what we can do. And that's our struggle here in Australia. I know our project is unfunded at the moment with supporting Mukurtu, and we have Australian research data sort of opportunities for funding, but they all privilege researchers. And, we keep saying this is actually about community needs. So, yeah, it's a real challenge, but I think the investment right now in people working out, well, what do they want to do? In Brewarrina, there's a book you might have heard of, all the way over there, but Bruce Pascoe has written a book called Dark Emu, where he's really challenged the colonial narrative of, our collections. And Brewarrina has fish traps that are, they've done the dating. They're supposed to be 50,000 years old. And there's so many tourists there now because of Bruce's book. So, for that community, it's about tourism. So we need to use the technology to support what they're doing. That's probably at the forefront of our mind.
I'll throw in a question while others are thinking. I was curious because, in the protocols that you were talking about, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander protocols were out so much, really predate the protocols here. I think it was like 95 and 2006. And then not endorsed by the Society of American Archivists here until 2018. and only still, even though it's, considered now kind of a standard or a sort of should be a shared value for archivists, still slow on the uptake in a lot of senses. And I'm wondering, with that lead time, whether you saw what kinds of aspects of the protocols you saw the most pushback on, and whether you saw, were there breakthroughs, and if there were breakthroughs, what they were. Were there moments where archivists who kind of had been reserved about them had a change in mindset, or what did you see happen? Have you seen folks sort of embrace them? And if so, what has helped to make that happen?
It's interesting. I think that the protocol around sacred material probably resonated in a way that is kind of fascinating, because people say, oh, that's a cultural thing, and that's secret and sacred to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we have to mark that as sensitive. And that if there were the right people in the institution to facilitate the conversation around ongoing management, that was great. But there's been a lot of observations in my doctoral studies around the fact that that actually closed a lot of collections off that should have been made more accessible. So I think that was one, and that's kind of fascinating, because if you look at things like governance and management, where it was talking about power structures and employment, they're the things that if you start to resource the change, you've got enough bodies around, the right people around, the advisory mechanisms. I think that was pretty light on. So there's been this fascination in the, we'll take care of the cultural material, which in some ways kind of puts Aboriginal people back in time, rather than, we're here now, we're doing stuff. But I would say overall, in Australia, there has been a real support for people talking about cultural awareness and cultural competency. That is a really big shift, that people do see it as part of their work role. And I mean, because we're such a smaller country, such a smaller profession, we have had the leadership around the endorsement, but they still need a lot of work. And we haven't had any aligned kind of action that has supported them. So we might look like we've done a lot, and we certainly have, but there are major gaps in actually doing the hard work that comes with implementing them.
Thanks for that. Sarah.
Hi there, Kirsty. This is just amazing to be crossing so many time zones like this today. And thank you also to Diana for opening up this for non-UMD. So it's a real pleasure to hear from you today, and thank you for such a fabulous talk. I really got a sense of your trajectory and how your ideas have shifted. It's certainly one thing to read your work, which I have, but it's quite another to hear you talk about how your thinking has shifted over time. So I find that right now I'm in this space of thinking about these concepts in archives that we've taken for so fundamental: provenance, arrangement, description. And I'm, thinking about, we're trying to broaden our collections, yes, but how about the concepts themselves? So specifically about provenance, when you have talked with your participants, say like for the dissertation right now, or thinking about your other past work, how do they talk about this concept of provenance?
Yeah, nice to see you, Sarah. Thank you. So it doesn't actually come up, I don't think, because actually the flow is the cultural flow between people and the authority of the stories through relationships. So I guess I shouldn't dismiss provenance in that total way. People, of course, care about context, but it isn't something that comes up in a way that institutions would hold so sacred in terms of their work. So, you'll see with someone again like Brad talking about their, you didn't write down any informants. So, that silence is so heavily perpetuated that, the provenance would support that collector, the surveyor, but Brad's sort of asserting his rights there to say, well, actually we're here and we know a lot more about that because that's our language, or, we know a lot of other stories that 2% and we've got the other 98%. So provenance isn't actually something that I think about a lot, because I think about context and relationships and the messiness of that in a much more sort of privileged way. And I think about the ways that we can support and give authority to that flow that's actually really difficult to contextualize and to record, more than thinking about provenance. But I'll keep pondering that question. But it certainly hasn't even come up in my doctoral studies at all.
Other questions? If not, I know we're just after 5 o'clock, so we should probably wrap up. I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and to Kristen for a wonderful talk and for a very early morning, and for permission as well to put this on YouTube afterwards so we can share this out with others. We're really excited to be able to do that. So thanks everyone so much. Happy Wednesday. And
Thanks, Diana. Thanks, everyone.
I'll just say a quick close to everyone. Thank you for supporting our series this semester. It was an experiment. I think it went really well. So we'll be back in the fall. So thanks everybody, and have a wonderful summer. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Beth, for coordinating us.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, everyone.